Okay, so have you ever, heard the name Dracula and just instantly felt a chill? That, primal fear. I mean, we all know the Count, right? He's like the ultimate vampire, suave, sophisticated, but also terrifying. But what if I told you the real story, the story of where he came from, was even weirder, more twisted? What if it wasn't just about, medieval brutality way over in Eastern Europe, but also tied to this, well, bizarre is really the word, this bizarre Irish legend, a legend about a bloodthirsty tyrant who just could not be killed, who wouldn't stay dead.
I like where this is going.
It's creepy, right? Welcome to Dance Plane. I'm Edward.
And I'm Lily.
And today on Dance Plane, we're diving deep, going all the way into the origins of the Dracula myth. And let me tell you, the roots, they're tangled, way more tangled than you might think. You guys sent us a ton of, well, a really interesting stack of historical accounts, folklore, all this stuff. We're going to sift through it, unpack it all. We're talking Vlad III, the actual historical figure. And then there's this maybe less well-known, but equally creepy Irish legend of the Abhartach.
Ooh, I love the Abhartach.
Yeah, we'll get to him. But first, as always, got to understand, how did these seemingly totally random, separate elements, how did they end up inspiring Bram Stoker? How did they come together to create Dracula? Lily, let's start, back at the beginning. Vlad III. I mean, beyond the myths, the legends, the vampire stuff, who was this guy?
Well, Vlad III, he was born way back in 1431 in Transylvania, which, fun fact, at that time, it was actually part of the Kingdom of Hungary, not Romania, as people often think.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, it's one of those historical quirks. Anyway, his father, now this is important, his father was Vlad II Dracula.
Okay, Drac, that's like key to the whole story.
It is. It's crucial. It comes from the Romanian word for dragon. And get this, Vlad II was a part of the Order of the Dragon.
Okay, wait. Order of the Dragon sounds kind of badass.
Right. It was like a super prestigious order of knights, kind of similar to those other crusading orders, Knights Templar, that sort of thing. Their whole deal, fight the Ottomans, stop the Ottoman Empire from expanding.
Got it. So Vlad II, Dracula, Dragon Order, powerful imagery there.
Totally. It gave him a certain, status, and that connection to the dragon, that definitely fed into the whole Dracula mythos. And speaking of Dracula, young Vlad III, he became known as, Dracula, which really, it just means son of Dracula.
So like a family name, but a family name with a kind of inbuilt sense of menace.
A little bit, yeah.
And his early life, if I remember correctly, it wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, was it? Didn't he spend some time as a hostage? I feel like that probably had a pretty big impact.
Oh, it absolutely did. Huge impact. In 1442, Vlad and his brother, Radu, they were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court. And this might sound crazy now, but back then, this was actually pretty common.
Really? Like normal diplomacy?
Well, diplomacy might be stretching it. It was more like brutal realpolitik, a way to make sure regional rulers stayed loyal, or at least didn't cause trouble. But yeah, for Vlad, this captivity, it messed him up. It really did. He saw firsthand how the Ottomans operated, their power, their ruthlessness, their control. He was isolated, probably scared, definitely saw some messed up stuff. And well, all of that, it definitely shaped him, contributed to that fierce, often cruel personality that we see later on.
Right, yeah. It's like, it makes sense in a way, like seeing that level of, brutality. It kind of warps you.
For sure.
So we've got Vlad, the hostage, shaped by Ottoman cruelty.
Yeah.
But then he becomes the ruler, right? The guy whose name still freaks people out centuries later. How does that even happen? How did you go from captive to, the Impaler?
Good question. And it wasn't a smooth ride. Not at all. His path to power, tumultuous is putting it mildly. So first, he actually held the throne for a little bit. In 1448, he was super young then. Had some Ottoman backing, but it didn't last. Overthrown, exiled, the whole deal. Spent years bouncing around Moldavia, Hungary, building alliances, playing the game.
Playing the Game of Thrones.
Literally. One key ally was this guy, John Hunyadi. Big deal in Hungary, powerful military leader.
Okay, noted.
So it takes a while, but finally, 1456, he takes back the Wallachian throne. And that's when things get really interesting, really dark.
That's when Vlad the Impaler, that's when he really earns the name, right? Capet.
Yeah. It wasn't a nickname you got for being nice. Basically, his preferred method of punishment, his signature move, was impalement.
Ugh, brutal.
Yeah. Sharpened wooden stakes, victims left to die slowly, publicly, sometimes for days. And we're not talking like a handful of people. We're talking large scale. Thousands.
Jeez. That's just, I know it was a different time, but it's still just, it's so horrific.
Totally. And it wasn't random. It wasn't just sadism. It was calculated. It was about instilling fear, maintaining control. Wallachia was a volatile place. Lots of enemies, internal and external. He needed to project power, and that's how he did it.
Right. Right. It's almost like a really, really dark form of public relations.
I mean, in a way, yeah. Gruesome PR.
Gruesome is right. Speaking of gruesome, there's the massacre of Targoviite, 1457. That one always sticks in my mind. Just sounds exceptionally brutal. What was the story there?
Oh, it was bad. Really bad. So Vlad invites all these nobles to a feast, right? Big party, lots of food, music, the whole 9 yards. Except these nobles, they weren't exactly loyal. They were plotting against him.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. So party's over, and Vlad has over 200 of them impaled.
Yikes. That's a message.
A very clear one. And it wasn't just about power. There was a very personal element to this one. See, Vlad believed these nobles were involved in the death of his father, and even worse, the death of his brother, Mircea.
How did his brother die?
Buried alive. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was awful. So you mixed the political stuff, the power struggle with that very, very personal revenge, and you get the massacre of Targovia.
Right. It's like you can almost understand the rage, even if the actions are just unimaginable.
It's a dark chapter.
Definitely. And then there's the one that always gives me chills. The Forest of the Impaled. 1462. Seriously, what a name. That must have been a horrifying sight. And strategically, against the Ottomans, pretty significant, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking psychological warfare, but on a scale that's just mind-blowing. So Sultan Mehmed II, he's the Ottoman Sultan, he decides to invade Wallachia. Big invasion force, the whole deal. And as they're marching, what do they come across? This forest of impaled captives.
How many are we talking?
Estimates vary, but something like 20,000. Imagine that. Rows and rows of impaled bodies as far as the eye can see.
It's beyond comprehension. It was meant to be. It was designed to break the Ottomans, to demoralize them. And you know what? It worked. Reports say that even Mehmed II, and this guy was not known for being squeamish, even he was sickened by the sight.
Wow.
Yeah. And some historians think it actually played a part in his decision to eventually retreat. So Vlad's brutality, his willingness to go to these extremes, it had a real impact. It might have even saved Wallachia, at least for a time.
It's horrifying and impressive at the same time. In a twisted way, it's kind of brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, brilliant might not be the word, but it was certainly effective.
Effective is one word for it. So, okay, brutal tactics, but also strategic goals, right? We talked about his enemies, the Ottomans, obviously, but also those Wallachian nobles. What was he actually trying to achieve? Big picture.
Two things, really. First, control. He wanted to centralize power, get rid of rivals, make sure everyone knew who was boss. Wallachia wasn't exactly a unified, stable place. The boyars, the nobles, they were constantly challenging him. He needed to assert dominance.
Right, so internal power struggles and externally.
The Ottomans, that was the big one. They were a constant threat, always pushing, always looking to expand. Vlad, he was all about independence. He wanted to keep Wallachia free, no matter the cost. And that meant doing whatever it took to keep the Ottomans at bay.
Makes sense. It's just the methods. They're hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. But you have to remember the context. 15th century Wallachia, it was a brutal world. Everyone was playing for keeps.
True. And we talked about the numbers, right? The estimates of how many people he killed. I mean, 40,000 to 100,000. That's a lot of people.
It is. But, and this is important, we have to be careful with those numbers. They might be, exaggerated.
Exaggerated why?
Propaganda. Seriously. A lot of what we know about Vlad, it comes from these German pamphlets. They were printed, circulated, the whole deal, and they painted him as a monster, a bloodthirsty tyrant.
Okay, I see. So like smear campaign, basically. And who was behind it? Well, partly Saxon merchants. They were based in Transylvania, had some trade issues with Vlad, weren't happy with him. And then there were his rivals, the Hungarians. They had their own reasons to make him look bad. So yeah, Vlad was cruel, no doubt. But the exact numbers, take them with a grain of salt.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, even back then, information warfare was a thing.
Totally.
So Vlad the Impaler, brutal, effective, but eventually even he falls, right? What happened? How does a guy with that much power, that much ruthlessness, how does he end up losing it all?
He had enemies, a lot of them. And eventually they caught up with him. The final betrayal, it came from a surprising place. Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary.
Wait, I thought they were allies.
They were at one point.
Yeah.
But alliances shift, politics are messy, and that propaganda we talked about, it did its job. Matthias turned on Vlad, imprisoned him in 1462.
Wow. Betrayal from a supposed friend. Where was he imprisoned?
Possibly Visegrad Castle. Not exactly a fun place to be.
No, I imagine not. And he stayed there for a while, right?
12 years. 12 years, damn.
Yeah. Eventually he was released. They needed him to fight the Ottomans again. And he even, briefly, regained the throne in 1476. But it didn't last. Same year, killed in battle near Bucharest. Some say it was his own men who did it.
Oh, wow. That's rough. Killed by his own people.
Yeah. And to add insult to injury, his head, it was sent to Mehmed II, like a trophy.
Jeez. What a way to go out.
Yeah.
But even then, his story, it doesn't really end, does it? I mean, his reputation, even today, it's kind of all over the place.
It really is. In Romania, he's often seen as a hero, a strong leader who stood up to the Ottomans, fought for his people. But in other parts of Europe, thanks to those German pamphlets, he's more like a boogeyman, this bloodthirsty monster.
Right. It's fascinating how those early narratives, they just stuck.
Oh, totally. There's even this one pamphlet. The title was something like The Frightening and Truly Extraordinary Story of a Wicked Blood-Drinking Tyrant Called Prince Dracula. I mean, it's like right there, the seeds of the Dracula myth are being planted.
Yeah, I see it.
The blood-drinking thing, that's interesting, because historically, there's no evidence Vlad actually drank blood. It's more of a literary embellishment.
Right. A way to make him even more monstrous.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Vlad the Impaler, brutal, but maybe also effective. And we've got these early stories painting him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. So how do we get from that, from 15th century Wallachia to Bram Stoker's Dracula? How does that historical figure, how does he become the 19th century vampire we all know?
Well, Bram Stoker, he was Irish, but he was living in London in the 1890s, working as a theater manager. But he was also, and this is important, he was a researcher. Like, he loved digging into stuff, spent a lot of time at the British Museum just reading, researching, particularly Eastern European history and folklore.
Okay, so he's interested in that part of the world. Makes sense.
Yeah. And one book he came across, it was published in 1820 by this guy, William Wilkinson. It was called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And in this book, there's a brief mention of a voivode Dracula.
Voivode, that's like a prince or a ruler.
Yeah, exactly. And Wilkinson, he talks about how this Dracula guy fought the Turks, across the Danube. And he also briefly explains the name. Says it means something like devil or dragon.
Oh, interesting. So not the full story, but enough to pique Stoker's interest.
Exactly. And this is important, Stoker. At this point, he probably doesn't know much about the real Vlad III. He just sees the name Dracula and it grabs him.
It's a cool name. I mean, even today, it sounds powerful, menacing.
Totally. And you know what's even more interesting? Stoker's original plan. He was going to call his vampire Count Vampire.
Really?
Yeah, but then he finds Dracula and he's like, nope, that's way better.
I mean, he's not wrong.
Not at all. So he has the name, and he has this vague connection to a place, Transylvania, which even back then, Transylvania had this mystique, It was seen as remote, mysterious, a little bit dangerous.
Perfect for a vampire story.
Right. So we've got the name, the place. But what about the actual character? How similar is Stoker's Dracula to the real Vlad III? What are the similarities, the differences?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Okay, so similarities first. Stoker, he puts Dracula's castle in Transylvania. Now, technically, Vlad mostly ruled Wallachia, not Transylvania. But Transylvania was his birthplace, and it had that vibe,
Right, that mysterious vibe.
Yeah. So location's kind of similar. Then there's the whole terror thing. Both Vlad and Dracula, they instill fear. They're powerful, ruthless figures. And then there's the whole fighting the Ottomans thing. Vlad did that historically, right? Defending his land. And Dracula, in the novel, he's kind of doing the same thing, but in a supernatural way. He's rebelling against death, against the natural order. So there's a parallel there.
Okay, so some thematic connections, but come on. Vlad wasn't a vampire.
Exactly. And that's a big difference. Huge. Vlad. Human. Cruel, but human. Dracula. Vampire. Undead. And that whole vampire thing, it comes from Slavic folklore. They have these creatures, stragoi. They're basically restless spirits. They rise from the dead, prey on the living, drink blood.
Classic vampire stuff.
Right. And Stoker draws heavily on that. Another difference, their vibe. Vlad was a warrior prince, pragmatic, focused on power, battles, the real politics stuff. Dracula, he's more aristocratic, more refined, but still menacing.
Right. More of a Byronic hero, maybe?
Kind of, yeah. And one more thing, Stoker's novel, it doesn't actually use any specific events from Vlad's life. It's not like a historical retelling or anything. So the connection, it's more about the name, the general location, that vibe.
Okay, I get it. So Vlad provided a cool name, some historical flavor, but the actual vampire stuff, the blood drinking, the undead, that's all from somewhere else.
Right.
So where did Stoker get those ideas? Where did the supernatural elements come from?
Well, it's partly just good old-fashioned storytelling. Stoker was a master of Gothic literature. He took that name, Dracula, that historical shadow, and he blended it with Victorian anxieties.
What do you mean?
Think about it. The late 19th century, time of huge change. Science was advancing, but people were also worried about the consequences. There was a fascination with the occult, with the unknown. And Dracula, he embodies all of that. He's this figure of darkness, this threat to modernity.
I see. It's like he's both alluring and terrifying.
Exactly. And then there's the whole Eastern Europe thing. In the Victorian era, Eastern Europe was seen as this mysterious, exotic, kind of dangerous place, full of superstition, ancient secrets.
The perfect setting for a vampire story.
Totally. So Stoker takes all of this, the history, the anxieties, the fascination with Eastern Europe, and he mixes it all together. And out of that, Dracula is born.
It's almost like a cultural Frankenstein's monster.
Kinda, yeah.
Okay, so we've got Vlad, the name, the history, we've got the Victorian stuff, the anxieties, the atmosphere. But then there's this other element, the one you mentioned earlier, the Irish legend of the Abhartach. That one's always fascinated me.
Oh, it's a good one.
It is. So tell us about it. Who was this Abhartach guy?
All right, so the Abhartach. He comes from County Derry in Ireland, way back, 5th or 6th century. And he was this chieftain, a local ruler. But he was also a tyrant, cruel, oppressive, the whole deal. And he had these, what people thought were magical powers.
Like supernatural powers.
Yeah, or at least that's how it was perceived back then. And the legend says he was eventually killed by a rival. Sometimes the stories say his name was Cassan.
So he dies. End of story.
Not quite. See, Abhartach, he doesn't stay dead. He comes back. Rises from his grave.
Okay, that's creepy.
Right, and when he comes back, he's thirsty, bloodthirsty, he demands blood from his people, needs it to survive, to keep this unnatural existence going.
A bloodthirsty tyrant who comes back from the dead. That sounds familiar.
Right, it definitely has some echoes of Dracula.
So how do they finally stop him? If he keeps coming back, I mean.
Okay, so according to the legend, they figure out that to really kill him for good this time, they have to bury him upside down.
Upside down.
Yep, under a thorn tree. And then they put a big, heavy stone on top of him, just to be sure.
To pin him down.
Exactly. And this is supposed to trap his spirit, stop him from rising again.
Okay, that's a pretty specific method. And does this tie into any real place?
Actually, it does. There's this site, the Slotaverde Dolmen. It's in County Derry, and it's still known as, get this, the Giant's Grave.
Oh, wow.
And the locals, they say that's where Abhartach is buried.
So a named figure, specific location, vampire-like traits. This is centuries before Stoker, right? I mean, what's the connection here? How does this Irish legend tie into Dracula?
The key is Stoker himself. He was Irish, born in Dublin in 1847. And growing up, he would have been surrounded by Irish folklore, stories, legends. It's very likely he heard the tale of the Abhartach.
You think so?
Oh, definitely possible. In fact, some scholars, this guy Bob Curran, he's done a lot of work on this, he thinks Stoker might have heard it from his mother.
His mother?
Yeah, Charlotte Stoker. She was a big collector of folklore, loved that stuff. So it's not a stretch to think that she knew the story. And maybe, just maybe, she passed it on to her son.
Okay, I see. So it's like, it's in the air, this idea of a blood-drinking undead being. It's in the culture.
Exactly. And think about it. The core elements, they're all there. The thirst for blood, the rising from the dead. Vlad, historically, he didn't do any of that. But Abhartach, he's the prototype.
It's true. And there's another important point here. We talked about Strigoi before, right? The Slavic vampire creatures. But Abhartach, he's different.
Right. Strigoi, they're kind of a general type of undead, a category. But Abhartach, he's a specific figure with a name, a story, a way to defeat him. It's more focused, more individual.
And that individual story, that specific way of dealing with him, that feels like a more direct link to Dracula, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's like Stoker took that idea, that blueprint, and he adapted it. Now, to be fair, there's no direct proof, no smoking gun. We don't have Stoker's notes saying, got this from Mom's story collection, but given his background, his Irishness, it's definitely plausible.
It makes you wonder.
It does. And there's another piece to this puzzle. Stoker was also into Irish Gothic literature. Like, he was a fan of this writer, Sheridan Le Fanu.
Oh, yeah, I know Le Fanu wrote Carmilla.
Right, exactly.
Classic vampire story.
And it came out before Dracula. So clearly Stoker was familiar with these themes, the undead, the blood drinking, all of that. It was all swirling around in his head.
Okay, so this is really interesting. We've got Vlad providing the name, the historical menace, and then maybe, just maybe, we've got Abhartach, this shadowy figure from Irish folklore, whispering the secrets of the vampire into Stoker's ear.
Yeah, I like that. It's like Vlad gives us the outer shell, the historical frame, and Abhartach, he's the inner spirit, the supernatural core.
That's a great way to put it. But it's not just these two figures, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be more to it. Other things that influenced Stoker, other things that shaped Dracula.
Oh, for sure. We can't forget about the broader context, like Eastern European folklore in general. That played a huge role.
Beyond just vampires.
Right. We're talking all sorts of creatures, strigoi, obviously, but also things like moroi. They're kind of similar to vampires, but they have their own specific traits, their own lore. And all of that, it fed into Dracula.
In what way?
Well, a lot of Dracula's specific powers, his abilities, they come from that folklore, like the whole nocturnal thing, vampires only coming out at night. That's a classic Eastern European belief. And then the shape-shifting, Dracula turning into a bat, a wolf, a mist. That's also from those traditions.
Okay, so those specific details, they're pulled from those stories.
Yeah, and then there's the whole how to kill a vampire thing, the stakes, the garlic, the sunlight. That's all drawn from Eastern European folklore.
It's fascinating how those beliefs, they seeped into this story.
And there's one more thing. Stoker, he never actually went to Romania.
Right.
Nope. But he read a ton of travelogues, books written by people who had been there, and one book, it was super popular at the time. It was called The Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard. And this book, it basically presented Transylvania as this land of superstition, this place where ancient beliefs still held sway.
So it reinforced that image, that mystery.
Exactly. And that fed perfectly into Dracula. It gave Stoker the atmosphere, the backdrop he needed.
Right. It's like he created the myth, but he also drew on these existing myths, these existing images.
Exactly. He was a master at blending the real and the imagined.
So we've got folklore, Eastern European vibes, but then there's also the Victorian era itself, right? Like the time period Stoker was writing in, that had to have some influence.
Oh, totally.
In what way?
Well, think about what was happening in Victorian England. There was this huge wave of urbanization. Cities were growing rapidly, and with that growth came anxieties, fears about crime, about disease, about the anonymity of urban life.
Right. It's like the city is this dangerous, unknown space.
Exactly. And Dracula, he taps into that. He's this predator, this outsider lurking in the shadows of London.
Yeah, I see that. It's like he's a symbol of those urban fears.
And there's more. The Victorian era, it was also a time of huge scientific advancement. But alongside that, there was this undercurrent of anxiety about where science was going, about the potential consequences.
Like a fear of progress.
Kinda. And Dracula, he represents that too. He's this ancient supernatural being. He's like a rejection of science, a reminder of the things that science can't explain, can't control.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like he's this force of chaos pushing back against the order of science.
Right. And then there's the whole blood thing. Blood transfusions were a new technology in the Victorian era, and they were kind of controversial. People weren't sure about them.
Makes sense. Sounds pretty freaky back then.
Right. And so Dracula, with his thirst for blood, he kind of plays on that fear. He becomes this symbol of the dangers of messing with blood, of tampering with the body.
It's almost like he's a walking, talking embodiment of all these Victorian anxieties.
Totally. He's the monster under the bed, but he's also a reflection of the deeper fears of the time.
Wow. So when we look at it this way, Dracula, he's not just a vampire. He's this incredibly complex figure, this blend of history, folklore, and social anxieties.
Right. He's Vlad the Impaler, but he's also Abhartach, the Irish blood drinker. He's a product of Eastern European folklore, but he's also a reflection of Victorian England.
And Stoker, I mean, he was brilliant to bring all of this together.
Oh, absolutely. He took these disparate elements, these threads from different cultures, different times, and he wove them into this tapestry of horror that still resonates with us today.
Lily, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
I mean, learning about all of this, it really changes how I see Dracula. He's more than just a monster. He's a reflection of us, in a way.
I think so too. He shows us what we fear, what we're fascinated by, what we try to suppress. And I think, in a way, that's what makes him so enduring.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for you, the listener, if you want to explore more fascinating topics like this, if you want to dive deep into the things that make you think, that make you question, well, we have a whole lot more waiting for you.
We do.
Head over to www.dansplain.xyz. We've got articles, partner products, all the latest episodes, everything you need to keep your brain buzzing. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never be afraid to dance plain.